Hey there, lovely soul. Welcome to Noah's Stories. Today's story begins with a hug in the rain between two strangers, both quietly broken. One unexpected moment leads to a journey of healing, love, and a life forever changed. If you believe a single moment can spark something magical, this story is for you. Late October in Seattle often came with rain, the kind that didn't pour or rush but whispered sadness across every street corner. That night was no different. Cold, damp, and quiet, with streetlights flickering in puddles like little ghosts. Grace Miller, 29, had just locked up the back door of Riverbend Reads, the old bookstore she managed. One hand dragged a heavy trash bag, the other clutched her thin coat, now soaked through. She exhaled, her breath turning into white mist in the chilly air. In the narrow alley behind the nearby church, she paused for a few seconds, watching red maple leaves shiver beneath the rain, a rare quiet moment in an otherwise busy day. Then she heard it, a muffled sob, broken and raw, coming from the shadows. It wasn't loud, but something in it made her stop. Grace wasn't the nosy type, but that sound, it held a kind of pain she recognized, like a wound reopened. She set the trash bag down and stepped closer. In the dim, hazy light of a distant street lamp, she saw him, a man slumped beside a dumpster, his shoulders trembling. His expensive suit was drenched and stained, his shoes caked with mud. His hands covered his face, shaking whether from rain or tears, she couldn't tell. At his feet lay a small wedding ring, cold and glinting on the wet pavement, like a promise that had shattered and fallen. Grace didn't know who he was. She didn't ask. She simply knelt beside him, placing a gentle hand on his shoulder. When he didn't pull away, she leaned in and gave him a hug. Not too tight, just enough for him to know he wasn't alone. Under the soft rhythm of the rain, two strangers shared a moment of silent pain. No names, no questions, no judgment, just presence and a hug. The next morning, Seattle awoke under a thin layer of fog and the familiar scent of damp earth after rain. Grace stood behind the counter at Riverbend Reads, flipping through the pages of a book about Pacific Northwest plants. Everything felt as usual, until Lily, her curly-haired coworker with oversized glasses, burst in, waving a newspaper in her hand. "Grace, you have to see this," she exclaimed, dropping the paper on the counter. The headline screamed across the front page. Tech billionaire Nathan Cole left at the altar. Below it was a blurry photo of a man in a suit standing alone amidst the extravagant backdrop of an abandoned wedding venue. Grace froze. The hair, the posture, the quiet collapse in his shoulders. It was him, the man from the dark alley last night. Nathan Cole, 32, founder of the social media empire Connect Us. Known for being reclusive, private, and completely detached from the media circus, now he was the talk of the entire city. Grace said nothing. She folded the paper and went back to work. But something stirred inside her. A strange unease, like a puzzle piece she hadn't realized was missing. 3 days later, the bookstore bell chimed. Grace was perched on a ladder organizing hardcovers when she heard steady footsteps approaching. She turned, and her heart skipped a beat. There he was, Nathan Cole, wearing a dark gray wool coat, his eyes tired but alert. In his hand was a small piece of paper. "Excuse me," he said, his voice low and hoarse. "Do you have The Alchemist?" Grace recognized him instantly, not from the newspaper photo, but from the way his shoulders still slumped slightly, as if carrying invisible weight. He remembered her words from that night, the book that helped her survive her own loss. And now he had come back, not just for the book, but for the woman who had held him when the world turned away. Since that day, Nathan began returning to Riverbend Reads more often. No schedule, no warning, just quietly appearing, sometimes with a cup of coffee, sometimes just browsing near the counter. He didn't talk much, and Grace didn't ask. He first borrowed The Alchemist, then came back for Man's Search for Meaning. Tuesdays with Maury. Books Grace once said heal wounds no one sees. She gave him the ones closest to her heart, not out of obligation, but because she could sense he needed them. They didn't talk about personal things. Their conversations were brief, focused on books, the weather, or a quote Nathan had just read. But there was something in the silence between them, a kind of peace that didn't need explaining. Sometimes, she'd catch his gaze lingering on her face a little longer than necessary, not in a scrutinizing way, but in a quiet, "I'm trying to understand you" kind of way. And every time her heart skipped, though she tried not to show it. She didn't know why Nathan kept coming back. Maybe it was the books, maybe the quiet comfort of the store, or maybe it was her. Lily, ever the observant one, didn't hide her suspicions. One afternoon, after Nathan had left, following a short chat about sci-fi novels, Lily pulled Grace aside and spoke bluntly. "You're really becoming friends with him? Grace, that's Nathan Cole. A guy like that doesn't just wander into a used bookstore." Grace frowned. "What are you implying?" Lily crossed her arms, her voice edged. "I'm saying, be careful. You're too kind, and who knows, maybe he's just using that kindness. Don't forget what you've been through." Grace didn't respond. She knew Lily meant well, but when she thought of Nathan's tired eyes and the way he turned every page like it mattered, she didn't believe he was that kind of person. One afternoon in early November, Nathan walked into the bookstore holding a small flyer, the ticket to Seattle's annual book festival. He placed it on the counter where Grace was labeling a stack of old books. "Come with me next week," he said, his voice steady but low. Grace looked up, surprise flashing in her eyes before she smiled softly and shook her head. "I'm not good with crowds. Just thinking about thousands of people crammed in a hall makes me anxious." Nathan didn't give up. "I don't like crowds either, but they've got a children's book section, like the ones you always send out. I thought you'd enjoy it." Grace hesitated but declined. Still, over the next few days, Nathan kept coming back with new reasons. One day he mentioned her favorite author would be signing books. Another, he talked about a rare bookstall with European imports. And once he simply asked, "Aren't you even a little curious?" His persistence made her smile, and slowly it softened her resolve. Finally, on a Saturday morning, when he showed up with a different flyer, this time for a book donation event in a small rural town, Grace sighed and put down her pen. "Fine. Just this once, no festivals, no crowds." Nathan's face lit up with a rare smile. "I knew you'd say yes." That day, Seattle's skies unexpectedly cleared. They drove together to a small town nearly an hour from the city. The atmosphere was cheerful but not overwhelming. Wooden tables were stacked with children's books, and the scent of fresh coffee filled the air. Grace felt more at ease than she had expected. Nathan didn't just watch. He helped her arrange the books, fumbling clumsily until he dropped an entire stack. She laughed, truly laughed, seeing him so unguarded and human. Then a little girl looked up and asked, "Mister, can you read this to us?" Nathan froze, unsure, but Grace slipped the book into his hands. "It's not hard. Try it." He began reading, awkwardly, his deep voice stiff and unsure, but the kids giggled with delight. Grace watched from nearby, holding a cup of coffee, smiling. He wasn't the man from the alley anymore. He was someone slowly learning to open up. One page at a time. By late November, winter had crept into Seattle earlier than expected, bringing brisk winds that chilled even the coziest corners of the city. Grace found her heart feeling lighter than it had in years, not because of anything grand, but because of the quiet rhythm forming between her and Nathan. He still came by the bookstore regularly, choosing his usual corner seat with a book and a warm coffee. She never asked about his past, and he never offered. It was an unspoken agreement: stay in the present, don't dig into old wounds. But the past never needed an invitation to return. One gray afternoon, as Grace was organizing books behind the counter, the doorbell chimed. She looked up, and everything froze. The woman who stepped in wasn't a regular. Tall, with gleaming blonde hair pulled into a sleek ponytail, a cream fur coat, and heels that echoed sharply on the wooden floor. She didn't belong in a used bookstore. She walked straight to the back corner where Nathan stood holding a copy of Dune. "Nathan," she said softly yet firmly, "I need to talk to you." Grace froze. Her heart pounded. The way she said his name, there was no doubt. This was Sienna, his ex-fiancée. Nathan set the book down, his face hardening. "Sienna, what are you doing here?" "I was wrong," she said, voice trembling, eyes fixed on him. "I left because I was scared. But I've thought about it a lot. I want to come back. I want to fix things." Silence. "No," Nathan said, firm. "You left and I've accepted that. There's nothing left between us." Sienna's hands clenched, her lips pressing into a thin line. "You'll regret this." She walked out, leaving behind a room heavy with silence. Grace hadn't meant to listen, but from behind the shelves, she saw everything. The way Sienna touched his shoulder, the flicker of hesitation in Nathan's eyes before he said no. It wasn't jealousy she felt. It was fear. Fear that she was just a stand-in, just someone to fill the silence Sienna left behind. That night, in her small apartment, Grace sat quietly in front of her bookshelf, holding The Alchemist, the one she always kept close as a compass. She reread the familiar line, "When you want something, all the universe conspires to help you achieve it." But this time, it didn't comfort her. Instead, it stung, like a promise made to someone else. Maybe she wasn't the one the universe had in mind. The next morning, she typed her resignation. A few days later, Grace left Seattle, taking the antique book press Nathan had gifted her, a small suitcase, and a heart that had barely begun to heal, now quietly breaking again. The day Grace left, Nathan had no idea. As usual, he brought coffee and walked into Riverbend Reads, thinking of all the things he wanted to share with her. But that day, the store felt unusually quiet. No Grace behind the counter, no cup of tea resting by the corner table. Lily stood there, her gaze colder than usual. She gently slid a copy of The Alchemist across the counter, the one Grace always kept close. "She's gone," Lily said flatly. "Left this for you." Nathan opened the book. Inside was a small handwritten note. "Find your way." For the first time in years, panic surged through him, not because of Sienna, but because of something deeper, a true, aching loss. He began searching for her, following fragments of memory, the coffee shop she once mentioned, the park bench she liked, even the little donut shop where she bought treats for kids. No one had seen her. Seattle had swallowed her whole. Then he remembered, just faintly, Grace once mentioned a nonprofit in Oregon she had considered joining, but never found the courage to leave Seattle. Maybe now she had. Without hesitation, Nathan got in his car and left the city behind, The Alchemist tucked into his coat, holding onto a fragile thread of hope that it wasn't too late. After hours of driving in silence, with nothing but the sound of the road and his own doubts, Nathan arrived in a small Oregon town. He pulled over outside a modest community center, unsure if he'd find her or if he even had the right place. Then, laughter spilled from the open door, and then he heard her voice, warm, steady, just as he remembered. And the boy realized that the most magical things weren't in books, but in the people we meet. Nathan froze in the doorway. In his hand, the book trembled. He had found his treasure, not in algorithms or innovation, but in a quiet corner of the world, in the woman who once held him in the rain. The children's laughter slowly faded as the reading session ended. The room grew quiet and warm again. Grace stood there, still holding the boy who fell off the Mayflower, not quite ready to leave the story or the emotions it stirred. Then she turned and met his eyes. Nathan stood in the doorway, The Alchemist still in his hand. There was no trace of the confident tech mogul, only quiet nervousness and unmistakable sincerity. She opened her mouth to speak, but he stepped forward, his voice trembling. "Grace, I'm sorry." She said nothing. He held up the book like proof. "I didn't know you saw that day, but I said no to her, without hesitation. I just didn't realize you'd already gone. I didn't know you thought I still cared about the past." He swallowed, eyes fixed on hers. "I searched all over Seattle for you. Then I remembered you once mentioned Oregon. I couldn't let you leave without telling you everything." Grace held the book tightly, her heart caught between old pain and something new. "Why now? Why not stop me then?" "Because I was a fool," he said softly. "Because I didn't realize how much I needed you until you were gone." She stared at him. Then he stepped closer and pulled her into a hug, not the hesitant, trembling hug from the alley, but one that held the weight of everything unspoken. She stiffened, surprised, but didn't pull away. He whispered into her hair, "That first hug, it helped me survive. But this one, I need it to truly live." She gave a teary laugh and murmured, "I'm not going back to Seattle just because you hugged me." He smiled. "I know, but I hope you'll give me a chance to do something bigger, not just books, not just feelings. I want us to help others like we once needed help." And so the Hug Foundation was born, a nonprofit devoted to mental health support, community libraries, and helping women through crisis. Nathan offered his resources, Grace gave her heart and purpose. They didn't just reunite, they began a journey, not just to love each other, but to reach out to the world and say, "We understand, we've been there, and we're here for you." 3 years later, autumn returned to Seattle, red leaves blanketing the streets, but the chill was no longer the same. The city breathed differently now, partly because of a narrow alley behind Riverbend Reeds. The place where Nathan once broke down in the rain was now known as Hug Alley. The walls were covered in vibrant murals, open books with arms, hands reaching out, and hundreds of handwritten notes strung across twine. A wooden sign read, "Hug Alley, where healing begins." The idea was Grace's. She wanted to turn a memory of pain into a symbol of hope. Nathan made it real, installing solar lights, hiring local artists, and turning the alley into a quiet refuge for anyone who needed warmth. That day was Hug Day, an annual event hosted by the Hug Foundation. The street buzzed with joy, free books, free hugs, hot coffee, and unfiltered laughter. Grace stood at the edge of Hug Alley holding a small note. "One hug can change everything." Nathan joined her, holding the hand of Eli, their nearly 2-year-old boy with light brown hair and deep blue eyes. Together, they looked down the alley, where it all began. No tears, just gratitude. Grace smiled. "If I hadn't hugged you that night, there'd be no Hug Alley, no Hug Day, no Eli." Nathan nodded, taking her hand. "I think about that every day." And there, among old books, autumn sunlight, and the hum of community, they weren't just hugging each other anymore. They were hugging the world. And there you have it, Grace and Nathan's journey from a rainy alley to building a foundation of hope for countless others. If this story touched your heart even just a little, we'd be so grateful if you gave it a thumbs up and shared it with someone who believes in the magic of connection. Don't forget to subscribe to Noah Stories so you never miss another tale filled with warmth, wonder, and quiet strength. Until next time, take care of yourself and never underestimate the power of a hug.